Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon. Here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug. Strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
And you have officially moved beyond the Matrix. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. I'm Rod Bryant along with my amazing co-host, Jerry the G-Man Gordon. I like G-Man. That sounds unique. But that kind of reminds me of the other G-Man, G. Gordon. Remember G. Gordon Liddy?
Yes, there's a story I could tell your listeners later about
Oh, really? Oh, okay, you got an interesting story. We all have interesting stories. By the way, if you're not watching on YouTube, we thank you for listening to it here on Israel News Talk Radio. Please leave us an email or a comment on especially if you're watching it on the the podcast format. Leave comments on that. Really appreciate it. Jerry, we have a guest that's familiar to everyone here, Stephen Bryan. And we're actually going to be giving our audience an update on the COVID, but some of the investigative aspects of it and how does that relate to us. So why don't you once again introduce our illustrious guest?
Our illustrious guest is a doctor in political science, I think, but he was a former Capitol Hill staffer who ended up in the Reagan administration as being a deputy undersecretary for technology and security. So he knows his stuff. He's a foremost military technologist in the U.S. He's an Asia Times columnist. His take on the coronavirus epidemic, if you want to call it that, is follow the numbers. It's sort of like the Joe Friday video clip that some people have seen from the 1950s saying, just give me the facts, ma'am.
Right. Just give me the facts, ma'am. Look, and it's really important. Explain to them why he is such an expert in this aspect of facts.
Well, that's primarily what his professional activity is all about, both in terms of national security stuff, but also in terms of what he writes from his column in the Asia Times.
I am impressed by the fact, if the audience doesn't see this most of the time, but when he comes on, he'll have a stack of papers of research that he's done on the subject matter. So he's not coming here just spinning stuff. He's actually talking about the numbers. So just the facts, ma'am, is what we're expecting. So we're getting ready to go into a break, and when we come back, we'll have Stephen Bryan with us. Listen to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Biblical.
Be beautiful.
Wear your crown.
Wrapping is my crown.
Do what married Jewish women have been doing for thousands of years. Celebrate the art of head wrapping. I'm Andrea Grinberg from Rapunzel.com. We have beautiful scarves, stunning accessories, scarves for faith, scarves for healing, and scarves for fun. Rapunzel.com. That's Rapunzel with a W. Or click on our banner on the Israel News Talk Radio homepage.
Rapunzel.com. Beautiful scarves, stunning accessories paired with tutorials, support, and a vibrant community to give you everything you need to start and perfect your head covering journey.
Don't forget, join the Rapunzel community group on Facebook to see, learn, and share your beautiful wraps. That's Rapunzel with a W on Facebook.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
Get 10% off your purchase with promo code RADIO. Go now to Rapunzel.com.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
I'm Rod Bryant, along with Jerry Gordon and our very distinguished guest, Stephen Bryan. We've had him on several times in the past, and of course, no different. we're going to have some great content that we want to provide you. We're going to be talking about the latest update in the investigation into the creation of the virus that has held our world in its grip for the last, month, 2 months almost now. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Jerry, why don't you go ahead and start with the volley of questions that we have?
Okay. Over the weekend, an alleged Five Eyes intelligence dossier was leaked to an Australian newspaper about China's cover-up of the Wuhan lab. Who are the Five Eyes, and what were the dossier's allegations and the criticism of it? Steve?
Well, the Five Eyes, first let's start there, because that's these are the 5 countries that cooperate in a special way on intelligence, and they're the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. That's 5. Those get really, they share information, mostly intelligence, in a unique way. It's highly classified usually. They very rarely ever make a statement that says the Five Eyes have said. So
that's why I was really shocked when I heard that. I'm like, whoa.
I don't know what we were seeing actually. Somebody wrote a report and said this is Five Eyes agreed content. They've repudiated it mainly by now for a couple of reasons. One political and one operational. The operational one's clear. They should never do anything like that.
Right.
And I don't blame them for pulling it on that basis. And the political one is that the Chinese went nuts. The U.S. CDC and NIH went nuts, and they said, "What are you doing? This is wrong." So the bottom line is that it has been yanked. What did it say? It actually said that the conditions at the Wuhan lab were very bad. That's not up to snuff, but that's not news. I mean, we've known that for some time. It didn't say that the virus came from the lab. That's a big distinction, or that the virus was man-made. Neither of those things was said. So, Rod, you said at the very onset, the so-called investigation. I would contend it's not possible for a number of reasons to do an investigation, and none will be done. And here's my reasoning. First of all, China has blocked any inquiries from outside. No one can go to China under any basis with the cooperation of the Chinese because they're not cooperating. So that's point one. Point two, connected with that, is the fact that they've already sanitized just about everything that could be investigated anyway. So there's no chance that you could go in there and find anything because there's nothing to find. Point three is that anyone in China that has raised the issue of concern about the lab or concern that it was man-made, all those things have been suppressed. They've pulled papers off the internet. They have removed some of the scientists. A few of them have groveled and apologized for being wrong. I mean, the usual kind of this communist approach to these sort of problems. So the ability to do an investigation from that perspective is very limited. Now, on the other side of the coin, the people who would do the investigation, namely the CDC, the National Institute of Health, or in Australia, the equivalent organizations, Japan, the same, all of them are compromised. All of them were cooperating with the Wuhan lab, had contracts with the Wuhan lab, were conducting research on bats with the Wuhan lab, and they want to hear about it. I mean, there's a sort of conspiracy here in a way to avoid implicating each other. And so they want this virus to be a naturally occurring virus that happened in the Wuhan wet market or something like that. That's as good an excuse as any. And they want to walk away from this and say nothing else. That's the end of it.
Stephen, what about the veracity of the information you spoke about last week of the researcher, I believe you said in France, that was saying that this most definitely was a hybrid mixed with AIDS or human illness?
What? There's two things. His name is Dr. Luc Montagnier. He's a Nobel laureate. He's not someone you could scoff at. I mean, you can call him any name you want, but he's a legitimate, serious, first-class scientist, microbiologist, and he's the guy that discovered HIV.
Oh, I didn't know that. So,
okay.
Yeah,
that's why he got the Nobel Prize. See, they didn't know what it was at first. People were getting sick, especially in the gay community, where people were getting these terrible diseases, but they didn't know what it was. It turned out it's a virus that's sexually transmitted, and that was discovered by Montagnier. So he knows what he's talking about, and he knows how to do inquiries about how viruses are composed and what the components are and all that. He's an expert. Of course, he's created a furor with his suggestion that the coronavirus has fragments of HIV in it. But we know, because we have already in hand papers that the Chinese and others, partners with, including U.S. partners, have written, who were attempting to use coronavirus and HIV to build a HIV vaccine, which would be a great thing. I mean, absolutely a great thing. That was around 2015 when that work was being done. So Montagnier's suspicion is borne out by research that was going on. Now, it was also the same thing that the Russians thought they found.
Okay, so it's been corroborated somewhat.
So it's somewhat corroborated.
Yeah.
I mean, it's you have to know what you're looking for, and I think what's interesting to me is that all the discussion, initially, a lot of the virologists who specialize in this sort of thing were saying, "Oh, it's a naturally occurring, this unusual, but it's novel." They call it novel, and it's zoonotic in the sense that it's passed from animals to people, but that it was, there was nothing in there that didn't suggest natural. That conversation about what's called the genome of the virus, how the components of the virus, has dropped off considerably. There was a lot of talk in the beginning, and now there's no more talk. And I think they can't sustain it because they can't prove it. So maybe Montagnier is right. There's some reasons to believe that. There's one very important reason to believe that he's right. And I'll tell you what it is. What Montagnier says is any man-made virus will decompose at some point.
Right. I remember you saying that last week.
In other words, it's not stable.
Right.
Okay. It'll go for a while, and then it will naturally decompose. And you'll see that, in the drop-off of cases, you'll start to see that it becomes weaker.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a sign that, now, I'm not a virologist. I'm not even a doctor. I have no scientific credibility, whatever. And I don't want to say anything that's wrong, but I can understand what he's trying to tell us. And he's trying to tell us that you should see a declining curve. Well, guess what? We're seeing a declining curve in Europe, Germany, Italy, Spain. They're all starting to get off of the requirements of the lockdown. They're easing the restrictions because the number of cases is dropping fairly rapidly. Israel, same story. New Zealand's down to 0.
Wow.
Yeah,
so really it's to our better interest if it was man-made or created, right?
Presumably, in a sense, yeah. I mean, ironically, I would say.
Ironically.
Now, so there's another piece of information, and I'll do it very quickly because I understand what you're telling me. Basically, in Arizona, they have discovered some people, at least one person, with coronavirus, but it's a different coronavirus. It's a mutation, and it's much weaker, and it's missing certain components.
Oh, okay.
And it's a mutation. But that's what he was talking about. This kind of mutation will get it weaker, and it will disappear. So that's what we may be seeing now. We may be seeing. I hope we're seeing.
Well, I hope so. Jerry, you have something about a minute. You have 45 seconds.
Notwithstanding that kerfuffle, yesterday the U.S. Department of Homeland Security released a report critical of China's handling of the whole matter. What were the allegations?
And we're going to have to do a quick wrap up, and then we'll come back into it after the break. Go ahead.
Okay, well, the quick answer is that the cover-up. They've covered up everything. So it's impossible to know what really happened.
So at this point, the only thing that we really have is speculation, maybe some intelligent guessing on exactly what happened. But you already said that the lab itself had some weaknesses in its protocol, correct?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And so it's like an accident waiting to happen. The interesting thing is when we come back from the break, you can expound on that if you'd like. But the question that I have is about support for that particular lab from, or grants from this country to that lab. And I'd like to talk about the nuances of that. I realize it's not a strange thing for this to take place. I mean, it's just part of the international research that takes place around the world. We do grants in a lot of different labs. So I'd like to understand that and help our listeners to be able to understand that. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. Just want to remind you, if you're listening on the podcast or on the station itself, you can watch the show, live stream it on the internet at YouTube. So go to Netiv, Netiv online, one word, Netiv online, and you'll be able to watch it absolutely free. We'll be right back after these messages.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
We are back from the break. Thank you so much for listening to Beyond the Matrix and making it a part of your education and information. We want to make sure that we give you all the best information we can. Before the break, Stephen, I was asking about grants that are given for research in different parts of the world, and specifically the Obama administration provided a grant to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Explain how that works and what is the significance of that.
Well, I think there's whether it's Obama or anybody else, really not irrelevant. It's not a political thing in that sense. The U.S., the Australians, the Japanese, the Canadians, probably the British, I'm not sure, the Italians and others, all have been cooperating with each other and with Wuhan and other laboratories in China. Right. It's been going on for a long time. And in these grants, they're not one-sided because they were matched by the Chinese government. So that you can't really, I mean, if all this was normal and everything was great, nobody would care, and that's Correct. The end of that. It's proper. They were all chasing the idea of finding vaccines for various kinds of viruses. Okay, that's presumably what was going on, and that's fine. I mean, it's dangerous, and the CDC knew it was dangerous, and in 2014, they stopped it for 3 years. They absolutely stopped it because they were afraid that the stuff would leak out. Mm-hmm. Now, by the way, along those lines, the intelligence agencies knew that risk very well. The Defense Department knew that risk very well. In fact, a U.S. Army lab was closed up by the CDC for 2 months. That's, of course,
was that the one in Maryland? Where was that?
Yes, that's right. That lab does a lot of secret research, mm-hmm. And some public research, but some of it's secret. And again, their main focus is finding vaccines. At least that's what they tell us. But the reason it was closed up, it was leaking. The sewage system wasn't working right. They were worried about contamination. They were not happy with practices they saw, and they just closed it for 2 months until it got fixed. So it happens here. If it happens here, you can imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
It happens in other places, not just here. So now, that's the straight frontal story. The problem. There were a couple of other problems though that need some attention and haven't gotten it.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is that, particularly in Canada, we know this case very well, but also in the United States, in at least 2 cases I know, one in Detroit and one in Boston, and there may be others in Texas as well. Materials from these labs were being illegally, improperly smuggled back to China. And I believe that the reason the FBI was looking into it in the United States and the Royal Mounted Police in Canada were looking into it was that they thought intellectual property was being stolen.
Right.
Okay. That the Chinese wanted to be the first ones with the vaccine because there was a lot of money to be made. Not biowar, but money. So it's probably more important than biowar anyway.
I would think so.
And so this illegal activity, or at least apparently illegal activity, was going on. In Canada, it was the lab in Winnipeg, where there were some Chinese scientists and students brought over from China to work in the lab. They were all pushed out of the lab as a result of the allegedly improper transfer of materials. There's no court case. This thing's still theoretically under investigation. In Boston, there is a guy that's been indicted for taking samples from a hospital. I believe it was cancer materials, and sending them to China. I don't know what that's about. No one's really explained it.
Well, recently, there was charges filed on.
There's charges on him.
Yeah,
there's charges on him. He's denying it, and has not gone to trial. And then in fact, he was put under house arrest, so now he's out of jail, but he still hasn't gone to trial. And then the case in Detroit didn't seem to result in any prosecution. So anyway, all this has been going on, and it has raised some real issues about how trustworthy you can be in these environments where there's so many strong commercial issues that are just under the surface that propel countries and individuals who want to get rich to do things they probably shouldn't do.
It is quite curious, Jerry. I'm going to bump it over to you next, but it's quite curious how the desire to be the first to make the most money has really benefited the world when it comes to research and being able to fix things and heal things. But at the same time, there isn't really a world body organization that regulates any of these things. I mean, you talked about the World Health Organization, but really?
Well, it's not their job either.
No.
I mean, this is the question is, every country has laws about protection of intellectual property.
Right.
And if those laws are violated, then you have criminal cases.
Right. Jerry?
And civil cases.
Talking about research and mutation, there was a preliminary study released by a joint U.S. and British team that revealed that coronavirus could mutate, making it more contagious. Why is this research finding of importance to other teams currently engaged in development of possible vaccines?
Well, if you believe it. I don't believe it. I mean, the evidence points the other way, doesn't it? It's not getting more, it's getting less. So the evidence points against that research, if it's research. I mean, I don't know where that came from. There's also these huge warnings. Dr. Fauci, again, is now saying, we're going to have another big whack of this stuff coming, a second wave, he calls it. How does he know that?
So I'm going to ask you, so let me just reemphasize this, because the listener is getting a full digest or diet of panic from the media and from who else?
a vested interest. There's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. that have a vested interest in beating on this because they want to beat on Trump.
Right.
I think this is a way to do it. It's really outrageous.
But the evidence points to something else. Is what
evidence is? I think the evidence is pointing the other way.
So for the listener, and this will make it very clear, that we have to be careful as a society that consumes all of this reporting to look at the facts and not look at the hype. And in this case, I would like you to re-emphasize the facts for the listener so they can understand what we're talking about. We talked about this whole flattening of the curve, and they're, sort of behind all of that now in some countries. Could you re-explain that? Because I think it would help boost the confidence of our listeners.
Well, I mean, we know already that in Europe, in most of Europe, other than France, but already even in Britain, which still has a very high number, it's starting to go down. In Germany, it's gone significantly down. In Italy, it's gone down. In Spain, it's gone down. So in New Zealand, it's 0. Japan is low, but it had a little bump, and now it seems like it's still pretty low. Korea is reopening now. Mm-hmm. China, I mean, we never can believe all the numbers from China, but China looks like it's normalizing. So the idea that this virus has a half-life is valid, I think. There's a very interesting study done by the Robert Koch Institute or Koch Institute in Germany, where they're measuring what they call the reproduction number of the virus. Okay, it means if one person is infected, how many other people does he infect? The idea is that if this is going to show you the true curve, okay, the reproduction number in Germany is now below 1.
It was up to like it was up to like 6.
Oh yeah, it was way up there. Yeah, it was way up there. Now it's down. It's down to 0.73, I think, the last. And there's a very interesting professor of finance at Leibniz University or Leibniz. I'm not sure the right pronunciation. On which day it is, I get it one way or the other, named Stefan Humberg, who says, that in fact, the value of lockdown now is about 0. It's not stopping anything because it's stopping itself. So we flattened the curve to relieve the hospitals, but nobody's got a hospital problem right now.
Right. I don't know that we really had a serious hospital problem, but I don't think it was wrong either.
At the moment, maybe we did, but it's gone.
Yeah.
In England, they built 5 huge centers to treat people. They're empty.
Right.
Simply empty.
Yeah, there are
hospital
there are major.
Europe is going home.
Yeah, there are major centers, cities throughout the U.S. and Europe that built temporary hospitals that never had a single patient in it.
That's right. So, I mean, I think that the evidence, this we call empirical evidence, not some projection by some scientist who thinks he knows better, but empirically, right now, we have a reduction in the United States and everywhere else.
Brilliant explanation. We have one more segment left. We want to come back and ask a few more questions, but it helps to bring peace of mind to people who are listening to, like I said, a full smorgasbord of panic and danger. And it's actually, hopefully, going to be good news for us. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. Thank you so much for listening. If you have an email that you would like to send it to rod@israelnewstalkradio.com. We'll be right back after these very few messages.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
If you're watching us on YouTube, I want to say thank you again for watching us. And if you haven't watched Beyond the Matrix on YouTube, you can do it right now, at least get this last segment in. Go to Netiv, N-E-T-I-V, online, and subscribe and watch the show. You're getting a lot of information in the break that you're not necessarily getting on the show because we just sort of accidentally get into these conversations. We try to bring it back into the show, but just want to let you know you're missing a lot of great content. Jerry, you guys had struck up a conversation during the break that I was not fully paying attention to, but I thought it was important that we talk about it now.
Yes, today President Trump is flying out to Arizona to visit one of the more vulnerable populations in the U.S. to the COVID-19 coronavirus, and that's the Navajo tribe. And on top of that, there's spike, if you want to call it that, that's a pun intended, in essentially meatpacking companies and workers all throughout the middle part of the United States. There's an estimated 5,000 plus cases that have erupted, a couple of dozen deaths in that regard. And these are close, closed environments. Add to that, the workers in those environments are typically immigrants or refugees by origin and have demonstrably bad public health standards in their community and lack of access. So, Steve, why don't you take that ball and run with it?
Well, well, you've already sort of answered your own question in a sense. I mean, the problem of packed environments is something that is still troubling around the United States and in other parts of the world. One example is nursing homes, which is terrible. And they're not, most of the nursing homes are just average people that are older and they're being cared for because they're elderly and have certain physical impairments or even sometimes have diseases like Alzheimer's and so on. And so they can't really take care of themselves. So people come in there to take care of them. And unfortunately, they may bring in the virus, and they have in some really tragic circumstances. And because they're closed environments, it spreads like crazy. And it's the devastation has been considerable, not only here, but in Italy and in Israel and in England, and it goes on and on. It's a mess. And then we have other kinds of packed environments. You mentioned slaughterhouses, which is one where people work very closely together and often come from immigrant communities who are also living very closely together, packed together because they don't have many people to a room because they don't have money to live in a different way. And then you have mass transit. And in New York, I'll give you just, they finally decided to close the subway at night because the homeless people are living in the subway cars. They just discovered this. I mean, and of course, the spread of homeless people who are living on the street have no sanitation really is very dangerous. And worse than that, then people get on the trains, and the same as in the UK, and I've seen it there, and the same as in France.
Mm-hmm.
They're packed together, and half of them aren't wearing masks, and 3/4 of them are sneezing. So, the spread of a virus through that modality is very high. And what applies to subway cars applies to buses, too. It applies to Amtrak. It applies to airplanes.
Right.
It's all over the place. So we really need a strategy. And I think that I'm a little disappointed that our government hasn't emphasized this. We need a strategy to deal with these cramped places. I mean, I would say that everybody that gets on a subway train, for example, ought to have a mask.
Right.
Required. don't get on if you don't have a mask. I would almost be willing to say they ought to have gloves on, but at least a mask. And there ought to be wipes there on the way in and the way out so people can wipe their hands, sanitizing wipes. These are not expensive things to do, and they would be tremendously helpful in stopping the spread of not only coronavirus, but lots of other viruses, and including even the common cold or strep throat or whatever you want to talk about. So it's time for us to, if you want to talk about practicing hygiene, this is a way we could practice hygiene on a long-term basis that would be very important.
Steve, we're in the midst of something called Operation Warp Drive. That's the attempt to develop vaccine against the coronavirus. In fact, today they announced 2 trials, one's in New York and one's elsewhere, that may have some interesting developments. And the people in England at the Oxford are talking about having something available by the end of June.
Yes, they're testing now.
They are.
Yes, and also in Israel, there are two organizations. One in the Upper Galilee, which has developed what they think is a vaccine, and the other and has crowdfunded some $12 million to get started on testing. And the other one is supported by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. It's a private group, but they also have started testing. And I believe there's some testing going on in Australia. I'm not sure about Japan, but I think there was some in Japan, and there's some in China. So there are lots of efforts being made to come up with a vaccine, and there are also a lot of efforts being made to come up with the drugs that'll treat the disease, either when someone already is infected, or sometimes just as a preventative. If you take it, you don't get it. I mean, this is hydroxychloroquine is one of those things that an Italian researcher has now found actually does act as a prophylactic. And if you're people who've been taking it for malaria on a regular basis, don't get, for the most part, don't get the coronavirus. They just don't. So the stuff seems to have seems to work. And she has gone to this Italian researcher has gone to some effort to explain why. So yeah, we're starting to move in this. I'm thinking by fall we'll have a vaccine.
There's a problem with testing in this country. Apparently, a big brouhaha arose over the FDA's handling of antibody tests, which are not terribly accurate at this point in time. And yesterday, former commissioner of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, suggested that the big push should be made on antigen tests, because they can be dirt cheap, relatively speaking, and they could be coordinated with some of the vaccines that are basically not only in development, but one in particular, remdesivir, that Galilee Sciences and the government believes can be helpful for more severe cases in that regard.
Well, it seems to have had there's 2 studies on remdesivir. One is a test that the company Gilead Sciences did in Chicago, which had fairly good results.
Yep.
And one that was done in China, which had completely negative results. And there's a reason for that. The reason was that the Chinese went and patented remdesivir, even though it's already patented by Gilead. And they want to show that the drug's no good so they can work a deal with Gilead and get it cheap. I think that's what's going on. But anyway, I mean, that's my surmise as a guess. But it seems to me that this is a very highly active field right now in terms of the efforts to find a solution. And I'm just not sure whether by the time we have a solution, the whole thing will be over anyway.
Or not.
Or not. I mean, who knows? If you believe what Fauci's telling us, we're going to have another wave of it. And people can be reinfected. But other guys say, no, you can't be reinfected. You already got it. So, I think it's so noisy out there right now that the best thing to do is to do the numbers.
Right.
Just do the numbers and try not to be political. Just try to do the numbers and see where we're at and take steps you think are reasonable based on the numbers. That's why Germany is relaxing its controls, and they will all be going back to work pretty fast. Israel is significantly relaxing its controls. Italy has started to relax its controls, same with Spain, and the British are getting ready to, and we're getting ready to. So, I mean, the numbers are the numbers. Let's go with numbers and see what happens later on.
The Dr. Fauci, from the very beginning, appeared to be he seemed to what's the word for wet on everyone's hopes that hydroxychloroquine was going to work. Right? I realize he's a scientist and he wants empirical evidence. He needs stuff tight. But he seems to be the guy that seems to be most pessimistic. Is that why he's being paid to do what he does? Or what's going on?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think he's a sincere guy. I mean, I think, doctors are always very conservative. They're trained that way because, first of all, they don't want to injure anybody. And
right.
Secondly, because they don't want to be sued.
False hope, too, can be a very dangerous thing as well.
Right. So, I mean, they are very cautious. And I think he was being very cautious. So that's all I could say about that.
Well, Stephen, it's been great having you on the show. As usual, you're a master of information and communicator. We really appreciate it. Guys, until this time next week, we're going to be saying shalom, and we'll see you the same time next week. And you guys are on YouTube. We really appreciate you sticking around, and you will have a little bit more content after the show. We call it the After the Show show. So anyway, until next week, we'll see you guys later. Everybody say shalom.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.